Please welcome the creator of Nike, Phil Knight.
So I'm here tonight with Mr. Phil Knight.
This is the shoe that really put Nike on the map. First year sales were $8,000. We made a $250 profit.
In the early 1960s, two visionary entrepreneurs, Phil Knight and his former track coach Bill Bauman, set out to redefine athletic footwear. They created a brand that will soon become synonymous with performance, style, and relentless pursuit. But then in 1971, they discovered a shocking betrayal that turned their world upside down. This gave them two options, either to quit or to just do it. This is the insane story of Nike and the birth of the swoosh. Phil Knight was born on the 24th of February 1938 in Portland, Oregon. Right from a young age, he developed an interest in running. Soon, his studies took him to the University of Oregon in Eugene. There, he met the legendary track coach Bill Bauman, who was a former Olympian and a famous coach in America who trained Olympic athletes at the time. Phil trained under Bauman as a middle-distance runner, with hopes of becoming an athlete himself. The two struck up a deep and meaningful friendship right off the bat. Bill Bauman had a fascination with optimizing his runner shoes. He would constantly tinker with different models to try and improve them after learning from a local cobbler. His passion for athletes and innovation will eventually inspire both him and Phil to create the Nike empire that we all know today. Eventually, Phil graduated with a journalism degree in 1959. Deep down within him, he wanted to be an athlete, but with a personal best of 1 mile in 4 minutes and 10 seconds, he had to face the harsh reality and admit that his dream was unattainable, as he hadn't reached the level required. However, he knew as a young man that he wanted to leave a mark on the world, but he just didn't know how. He was confused about his future and unsure of what he actually wanted to do with his life. So, like many people in his position, he enlisted in the army, hoping to find some meaning and direction in life. But he still felt lost, so he quit the military after just a year of service. He followed his God and enrolled in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. It was there that he started to gain a sense of direction in life. One of the courses he took there was Frank Schellenberger's business class, a class which he found very interesting. But what Phil could not tell at the time was that the initial foundations of the Nike empire will be laid in that class. One day, the class got an assignment to invent a new business. Phil, as a person who always had a passion for running, came up with a business plan centered around selling imported sports shoes from Japan. His paper was titled, "Can Japanese sports shoes do to German sports shoes what Japanese cameras did to German cameras?" You see, Phil had noticed how high-quality Japanese cameras at the time had gradually overwhelmed German cameras in the US market, and he wondered if Japanese shoes could do the same. Now, at that time, two German shoe companies, Adidas and Puma, had dominated most of the sales in America. But Phil had heard rumors that the Japanese had innovated some cool new shoe designs. Of course, at that time, it was just another school assignment. Nevertheless, he had no way of knowing that his paper will soon lead to the creation of the biggest sportswear brand in the world, surpassing both Adidas and Puma today. He went on to devise a business and marketing plan for importing high-quality running shoes from Japan, where they are relatively cheaper, and selling them in the United States at a high profit margin. He spent weeks and weeks on the paper, going to the library and devouring everything he could find about importation and exportation and about starting a company. Phil couldn't tell at the time, but that assignment was actually taking roots in him. When he delivered his presentation in class, everyone watched and listened with the usual formal boredom. Some even thought his idea was a bit crazy. Eventually, he graduated with a master's degree from Stanford in 1962. But unlike his friends at the time, he was still unsure of what to do next with his life. However, the shoe idea was still stuck in his head, cause deep down within him, something was telling him that it might work, even though he had never been to Japan at the time or have any connections there whatsoever. One fateful day, Phil wondered, how can I leave my mark on the world unless I get out there first and see it? So he set out on a trip around the world in 1962 right after his graduation. He even sold his cherry black 1960 MG to raise money for the trip. He traveled all across Europe, Asia and Egypt with a friend of his. They even visited the pyramids and the temple of Nike, the goddess of victory in Greece. Soon they bought a one-way ticket to Hawaii. There they spent the next 10 weeks in Honolulu surfing and frequenting dive bars. To make some extra cash, the two began selling encyclopedias. Phil of course didn't like the job, as he was a shy person. In fact, he never even actually closed a sale. However, all this time, the shoe business idea was still stuck in his head. So after a while, he decided to leave his friend behind who had met a girl and fallen in love. And after they said their goodbyes, Phil boarded a plane for his next stop. And guess where he's going next? On the 22nd of November 1962, Phil Knight, 24 years old at the time, sat on a plane bound for Tokyo, Japan. Now, Phil was not fluent in Japanese. However, he's a big fan of Zen philosophy. And after seeing how cheap shoe prices were in Japan, he thought to himself, there must be an opportunity here. One shoe brand particularly caught his attention. The name of the brand was Tiger, and the name of the company that produces them was Onitsuka. So with no business experience whatsoever, Phil called and set up an appointment with Onitsuka, which was based in Kobe. Next, he bought and studied a book on how to do business the Japanese way. He then got on a 7-hour sardine-packed train ride from Tokyo to Kobe. As you can imagine, Phil was both excited and scared at the same time. In fact, he couldn't even get a proper sleep the previous night because of excitement. The following morning, he hailed a taxi and raced to the meeting. Upon arrival, a group of 4 executives met him in the lobby. Phil introduced himself as an American shoe distributor, which was a lie. One of the Japanese executives said his name was Ken Miyazaki, and he offered to give Phil a brief tour in what was the first shoe factory Phil had ever seen at the time. And for sure, he found everything about it interesting. Soon they head into a boardroom. Once the meeting was in session, Phil began with his speech. He had already developed the numbers for his ideas in the research paper he had completed back at Stanford. He was basically reciting his old assignment, as he had already memorized lots of facts and statistics about the American shoe market of the time. And to the executives, he seemed to know what he was talking about. In fact, the more he spoke, the more they took him very seriously. But while he was in his speech, something unexpected happened. Sitting across the conference table from half a dozen Japanese corporate suits, Phil had the question, which company, Mr. Knight, do you represent? Now here's the thing. Phil was really passionate about importing Japanese shoes into the United States, but he has no established business yet, and concealing that information will just send things crashing down, considering the fact that he had already built himself up in the eyes of the executives. Yet, while he was working on his business pitch and strategy, he somehow forgot a name for his yet-to-be company. However, he still had one advantage. You see, it was the 1960s, and the internet was not yet a thing. Unlike today, where most businesses have a website, that wasn't the case back in 1962. What this means is that he can basically get away with a lie, and so he did. With only a few seconds to answer the question, his mind rushed to the time when he was a kid. He remembered the blue ribbons that were hanging on the trophies he had won as a child athlete. So with that, he broke the awkward silence and said, "Gentlemen, I represent Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon." He continued to march on through his selling points. Phil, as a runner himself, believed that the right pair of shoes mattered. More importantly, he really understood the American shoe market of the time, as Adidas and Puma, both German shoes, made up most of the sales. But he told the executives if Onitsuka can get its Tigers into American stores and price them to undercut Adidas and Puma, it could be a hugely profitable venture. After he had delivered all his talking points, there was silence across the room. Moments later, all the executives began speaking in Japanese over one another in loud, excited voices. This was perplexing to Phil, who could not understand a word of what they were saying. Then something weird happened again. They all stood up, said nothing to Phil, and left the room. Now, if he had understood Japanese, he'd have been spared the suspense. He anxiously waited for them, and minutes later, they came back with shoe samples. And one of the executives that went by the name Ken Miyazaki told Phil, "We've been thinking for a long time about the American shoe market for a while ourselves." As it turns out, Phil's arrival was an answer to their prayers, as they had been planning to break into the American shoe market for a while themselves. With that, 2 hours later, Miyazaki and Phil came to an agreement that he would represent Onitsuka and sell their Tiger shoes in the United States. Phil immediately contacted his father and told him to send Onitsuka a $50 money order so that a shipment of 15 shoes will be sent to his family home in Oregon. After he left, he sat alone on a chair in the Osaka airport and asked himself, "Where am I going next?" One voice said he should rest home and get this business going. The other said if you don't go around the world now, you'll not go for 4 or 5 decades. So he flew to Hong Kong for his last stop. 4 months later, after an incredible world tour of visiting over a dozen cities, Phil was back home in Portland. So he began to wait for the shipment of the Tiger shoes. However, days turned into weeks, weeks into months, but yet the shoes never arrived. He was so devastated, yet he remained optimistic. He thought he had won the executives over, but now he couldn't understand why the shoes never arrived. So he wrote them a letter asking them what the dilemma was all about. He got a speedy reply from Onitsuka which said, "Shoes coming in just a little more days." So as opposed to just sitting around and doing nothing, Phil got a job as an accountant in Portland, which he didn't like very much. But then one morning in early 1964, Phil received a delivery of a large box covered in Japanese writings. He hurried down to the basement and opened the box, and behold, 12 pairs of Tiger shoes were inside. After more than a year of waiting, 14 months to be exact, the first Tiger samples had finally arrived. He immediately mailed 2 pairs to his former track coach Bill Bauman at the University of Oregon, hoping to gain both a sale and an influential endorsement. But what he got was even better. Bauman not only ordered the Tiger shoes, but also offered to become a partner with him. The two men agreed to a partnership by handshake on the 25th of January 1964. There they established not Nike, but Blue Ribbon Sports, the company that will eventually give birth to Nike. In 1964, Phil Knight and Bill Bauman both entered into a 50-50 business deal for the ownership of their new company, Blue Ribbon Sports. They each brought out $500 as seed funding. Later that day, Phil wrote a letter to Onizuka and asked if he could be the exclusive distributor of Tiger shoes in the western parts of the United States. He also asked them to send 300 pairs of Tiger shoes as soon as possible at $3.33 per pair. That was roughly $1,000 worth of shoes. Days later, a letter came from Mr. Miyazaki, who agreed and said, "Yes, you can be the exclusive distributor for Onizuka in the West." Phil was ecstatic after getting that letter. He immediately quit his job at the accounting firm, and all he did that spring was sell shoes out of the trunk of his Valiant. This was because he had been rejected at every sporting goods store he had went. People constantly said things to him like, "What this world does not need is another track shoe." So he employed a very simple strategy. He drove all over the Pacific Northwest to various track meets, and between races, he'd chat up the coaches, the runners, the fans, and show them his wares. And most of the responses he got were positive. He later said in his memo, "I couldn't ride others fast enough." On his way back to Portland, he was puzzled over his sudden success at selling. Cause if you remember, I earlier mentioned how he was unable to sell encyclopedias back in Hawaii. But with selling shoes, it was so different. He then realized that it wasn't the selling, it was because he genuinely believed in selling running shoes as he was a runner himself. Sometimes people wanted his shoes so badly that they'd write to him or call him saying they'd heard about the new Tigers and just had to have a pair. So it quickly became clear that a demand existed for these cheaper but still high quality alternatives to Adidas and Puma. In their first year in business, Blue Ribbon Sports sold 1,300 pairs of Japanese running shoes, grossing about $8,000. By 1965, the fledgling company had acquired a full-time employee, and sales reached $20,000. The rising sales enabled Phil to hire more and more salespeople, most of which were ex-runners who were inspired by the business model and because they worked solely on commission of $2 per pair. In 1966, Blue Ribbon Sports opened its first retail store at Pico Boulevard in Santa Monica, California, next to a beauty shop. This was so their employees would no longer need to sell inventory from the back of their cars. In the year that followed, Blue Ribbon Sports expanded retail and distribution operations on the East Coast in Wesley, Massachusetts due to increase in sales. While Phil was busy handling the business side of the operation, the actual innovation was coming from Bill Bauman. Bauman was all about the innovative side of things, and with every new shipment they received, he would open a few shoes to see how they were made, and he'd always try to improve them. For example, adding to the cushion or using more lightweight materials. And he'd constantly send back notes to Japan requesting changes. So in a way, Bauman was basically designing shoes for Onizuka. In 1965, Bauman proposed a new shoe design to Onizuka. Little did they know at the time that this shoe design will turn out to be both a major success and a source of conflict between Blue Ribbon Sports and its Japanese supplier. Bill Bauman is also credited as the guy who single-handedly brought jogging to America, because back then jogging was not as popular as it is today. So in 1966, he wrote a book about it that sold over 1 million copies. And since they sold shoes that are well equipped for jogging, the book drove traffic back to them. So from 1964 to 1972, Phil Knight and his former track coach Bill Bauman distributed Japanese-made running shoes in America and gradually laid the foundation for the Nike empire. In 1969 alone, they sold over $1 million worth of Tiger shoes. By 1972, Blue Ribbon Sports had pulled in over $2 million worth of sales. But the rapid opening of new stores and the rapid success of Blue Ribbon Sports often left Phil in a precarious situation, where he had to constantly worry about cash flows to support the high sales volumes. He found himself in a position where he had to hire more staff, add more facilities, and order more shoes. While they were surviving, Blue Ribbon Sports always had short leads from the bank. Plus, Onizuka was slow in responding to product suggestions and innovations, and sometimes even ignoring them completely. Critically, they often sent shoes late, creating massive headaches for Phil as he navigated the precarious financial situation. And when the shipments from Onitsuka did finally arrive, they often contained the wrong number of shoes, often the wrong sizes and sometimes the wrong models. This kind of disarray clogged their warehouses and rattled their sales reps. But the main problem they faced was Bauman's Cortez. At that time, it was simply too popular. They've gotten people hooked on the shoes and turned them into full-blown Cortez addicts. But now they couldn't meet the demands. This created anger and resentment up and down the supply chain. Phil will later learn that Onitsuka was feeding domestic orders first and shipping whatever was left to them, which was quite unfair, but there was not much they could do. Another thing that Blue Ribbon Sports did not know at the time was that Onitsuka had brought in a 30-year-old man named Shoji Kitami with the charge to expand export sales. So in an attempt to improve Onitsuka's delivery schedules, Phil invited Onitsuka's officials to visit Blue Ribbon Sports headquarters in Oregon. However, during the official's visit, Phil discovered a shocking betrayal. Mr. Kitami had secretly gone behind his back to establish other shoe distributors throughout the United States, even though they were only halfway through a new 3-year contract which gave Blue Ribbon Sports the exclusive rights to market Onitsuka Tigers in the entirety of the United States. But now that Onitsuka had gained a significant foothold in the US market, they decided to move on to more experienced distributors to expand sales and increase their revenues. Phil desperately pleaded with officials to reconsider, but Mr. Kitami instead responded with an ultimatum. Either Blue Ribbon Sports will sell 51% of their company to Onitsuka, otherwise they will go ahead with the new distributor agreements.
I did an instant cost-benefit analysis, which led me to this dilemma. How do you say go to hell in Japanese?
The breakup was painful, but in a way necessary. Following the split with Onitsuka, Phil decided to strike back. He collected his team together and decided to create a new brand that will be their very own. Initially, Phil wanted to name it Dimension 6. However, their first employee, Jeff Johnson, suggested the name Nike, which is the name of the Greek goddess of victory, the very same deity whose temple Phil had visited years back when he set out on that infamous trip around the world. Johnson claimed that he had seen the goddess in a dream the previous night. With the name out of the way, they now need a new logo.
Who designed the swoosh?
A graphic artist at Portland State University. We said we'll pay you $2 an hour to practice, to get some designs, and she spent 17.5 hours on that. When we went public, we gave her 500 shares of stock, and she hasn't sold a single share, and they are now worth $1 million.
Prepared for the fight of his life, Phil flew to Japan and contracted a chain of manufacturers that will produce new versions of the Cortez, which will then swap the tiger stripes for the Nike swoosh. His reason for contracting more than one manufacturer was to prevent further occurrences of supply chain disruptions. Over time, Nike expanded its manufacturing operations to more countries in Asia such as China, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. In recent years, Nike has also opened factories in Brazil, India, and other parts of the world. This same pursuit of cheap labor will later put the company in a bit of a problem, but at the time everything was perfect. So despite Onitsuka having a head start with their own versions of the Cortez, Nike quickly caught up and propelled ahead, all thanks to Phil's marketing prowess and Bill Bauman's technical innovation of the new versions of the Cortez. Later on, Nike decided to file a lawsuit against Onitsuka. The two companies had a dispute over the right to use the name and the design of the popular Cortez, which was developed based on Bill Bauman's idea. In the end, the judge settled that both companies could sell their own versions of the model. However, Onitsuka paid more than 100 million yen in legal fees and settlements. They were also made to change the name from Tiger Cortez, so they named it Tiger Corsair, leading to the only sneaker to become a best-selling model for two different shoe companies, as the Nike Cortez and the Tiger Corsair. Onitsuka continued in a respectable position in the worldwide shoe market. Nike, on the other hand, went from strength to strength and became the juggernaut that it is today. After coming into existence proper, Nike Inc. continued the success of Blue Ribbon Sports, helped first by the Nike Cortez and then by Bauman's innovative waffle sole design. In 1971, the Oregon's Hayward Field was transitioning to an artificial surface, and Bauman wanted a sole which could grip the grass or back dust without the use of spikes. While thinking over breakfast on a way to give running shoes more traction, Bauman noticed the grooves in the waffle his wife made him and wondered what they would look like inverted. Not one to pass on an idea, Bauman poured melted urethane into his wife's waffle iron. Unfortunately, he forgot to add any anti-stick agent onto the iron and it glued shut. But nevertheless, the idea had taken root, and with the help of another waffle iron and presumably a good spray, he ultimately designed the Moon shoe in 1972, so named because the waffle thread was said to resemble footprints left by astronauts on the moon. Further refinements resulted in the iconic waffle trainer in 1974, which further helped fuel the explosive growth of Nike. This shoe was a major success for the company and the first of many to come. In fact, their sales even rose to $25 million with solid profitability. Phil even began making preparations of taking the company public. And in December of 1980, Phil was finally able to take Nike public. This added millions to his net worth and made their cash flow problems disappear almost overnight. Since then, the company had only continued to grow, helped on in part by a series of clever ad campaigns, most famously the 1988 Just Do It ad campaign, which apparently was inspired by the last words of American murderer Gary Gilmore right before the firing squad. And so by the late 1980s, the Nike Swoosh trademark had become prominent and Phil was well on his way towards managing a multi-billion-dollar company. Just like Phil's crazy idea of starting a shoe importing company, he met M. Frank Rudy, a former aerospace engineer who happened to have his own crazy idea. He proposed to inject air into running shoes for better cushioning and better support. No matter how comical his recommendations were, Phil decided to give it a try. Now, as we know, Nike Air is one of the outstanding lines of shoes in the world. Being an athlete himself, Phil wanted to shape his company around the needs of athletes. He wanted to create products that the world's greatest athletes would want to use and be associated with. The company's escalating fame allowed Phil to rope in more world-famous sports people for endorsement. People like Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Andre Agassi, and many more. These people went on to become great assets for the company. In the 1990s, Nike expanded its business and branched out into hockey, golf, soccer, and many more, with a wide range of products including jerseys, shorts, cleats, and base layers to name a few. Their aggressive expansion strategy paid off and the company enjoyed more than $10 billion in annual sales before 1999. By far the most lucrative endorsement Nike ever had was with Michael Jordan. Spotting potential, Nike tried to swoop in for an endorsement from Jordan before the start of his first season with the pros in 1984. The deal proved a smash hit for Nike, with Jordan quickly rising to superstardom and his shoe line Air Jordans hitting the market to make over $100 million in revenue by the end of 1985 alone. Air Jordans to this day continue to be a cash cow for Nike. Phil Knight resigned as the CEO of Nike in November of 2004, though he's still the chairman of the board. The company, which basically started out in the trunk of his car, today employs over 83,000 people with a market cap of more than $150 billion, making it the biggest and most valuable brand among sports businesses. The story of Nike and Phil Knight is an incredible story of betrayal, resilience, and perseverance, which teaches us that success often begins with taking that first step, even if it means starting small or facing uncertainties. Just do it is more than a slogan. It's a call to embrace challenges, overcome doubts, and relentlessly pursue our goals. The Nike story serves as a powerful reminder that the path to achievement is forged by those who dare to act and persevere with unwavering determination. So in the face of aspirations, uncertainties, or dreams, let the story of Nike and Phil Knight echo to you the words, just do it.